flood immunity is the talk of the town at the moment. I mean, hell, I got on a bus the other day, and even the bus driver was talking about it. And so, given all the rage, I thought it was time to go over all of the species, the pseudo-species, the groups, and also the entities within Halo's lore that have both confirmed and also rumored immunity to the flood. This is the most comprehensive video about flood immunity on the entire internet. So, take a seat, grab yourself a nice bowl of 10 million year old corrupted powder, and let's begin. So, starting out, I want to cover a few species that are commonly believed to be immune, but in fact aren't. Notably, the jackals, the drones, and the grunts. Now, we never see any grunt, jackal, or drone combat forms in the original trilogy, despite how large the flood outbreak got, so people have kind of just come to assume that they're immune, but they absolutely aren't. You see, the flood are an intelligent and very selective parasite. They don't just infect anything, they go for the strongest possible hosts. And you see, the problem with the jackals, the grunts, and the drones is that, well, they aren't very strong. They lack the biomass of other potential hosts like humans, elites, or brutes, and so they're typically passed over in favour of them. The bony, spindly build of the jackals and the drones, and the small, rather weak build of the grunts don't exactly make them prime candidates for infection, so it's not that they're immune, but more so, they're just not an infection form's first choice for dinner. However, grunt and jackal combat forms do still exist. I mean, we literally saw them in Halo Wars, and even if they aren't turned into combat forms, all of these species, and by extension any species immune to flood infection, can still be used as raw biomass to build hives and grave mines. Even if they aren't suitable candidates to become a combat form, and even if they can't be infected, the flood can always find a use for an organism's delicious, succulent biomass. So, the first species that we know for absolute certainty are immune to flood infection are the Letgolo, the hunters that make up the worms, and many other strange creatures. But this one comes with a caveat. You see, technically, each individual Letgolo worm can be infected, but for some strange reason, all of their larger gestalt forms cannot. Each individual Letgolo worm has a central nervous system, which is the absolute requirement for flood infection. So, although they're likely too small to be infected by, say, an infection form, spores and other means of infection would theoretically be able to turn them into, well, a worm-based combat form. And given their small build, their agile mobility, and their razor-sharp teeth, they could actually be really effective vectors for the parasite. However, this is as far as the flood seem to be able to go with them. The main attribute of the Letgolo is their ability to combine to form gestalt forms. In doing so, their collective sentience combines to create something of a neural network, a compound intelligence that drastically increases their strength, their intelligence, and also the sensitivity to their surroundings. And it's this process that the flood seem to have some sort of an issue with. Infected worms seem unable to combine to form gestalt forms because gestalt forms don't have a central nervous system. All their individual worms do, but they do not. So, the next question is, why can't the flood just control each Letgolo in the gestalt form individually? Well, my theory is that it has something to do with the compound intelligence that the Letgolo create when they combine. The flood themselves operate as a hive mind. All forms kind of connect, for lack of a better word, to the flood's collective consciousness that's directed by either local key mind forms or grave minds. And so, I have a feeling that the Letgolo creating their own compound intelligence when they combine kind of clashes with the flood's hive mind and makes them impossible to control, even individually. You could argue that it could also be down to just the raw intellective power that it'd take for the flood to control hundreds, if not thousands, of worms individually to function like their gestalt forms. But that said, the flood's intelligence is vast and theoretically infinite, so I don't think that'd be a problem. Regardless though, this explains why flood-infected hunters just aren't a thing, and it also means that the new slugmen, another gestalt Letgolo form, are immune as well. And to go one step further, there's even a strain of Letgolo that the foreigners tried to weaponize as an anti-flood organic weapon, the Thano-Letgolo. Now, the history of the Thano-Letgolo is murky and, well, at best, entirely theoretical. but only theorized that because they had a specific sensitivity to electromagnetic radiation, magnetic fields, and radio waves, the foreigners may have tried to use them to eliminate any technology that the parasite had adapted and utilized before foreigner military personnel were deployed to either destroy or recover what remained. Speaking of destroying something, I recently realized that I was still being charged every damn month for Paramount Plus. Yeah, thankfully today's sponsor, Rocket Money, is here to help. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower your bills, and manage your money better. And I'm using Rocket Money to well and truly destroy that Paramount Plus subscription, along with a few others as well. The app safely and securely identifies recurring charges and cancels unwanted subscriptions. You can even cancel them with only a few taps within the app, which means no more annoying customer service calls or, God forbid, live chats. I'm also using it to lower my bills as well. By just uploading a photo of a bill and tapping a few buttons, Rocket Money will negotiate your bills for you, from phone bills to ISP bills. Rocket Money has helped save its customers up to $740 a year and has helped to cancel over $500 million of subscriptions. So, to save more and spend less, join the over 5 million Rocket Money members today. Just head to rocketmoney.com/HiddenXperia or click the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock even more features with Premium. That's rocketmoney.com/HiddenXperia to get started for free. Next up, we have an immune species that are grossly misunderstood: the engineers. Now, technically, the engineers aren't actually a natural species, but rather a biomechanical race of artificial organisms that were created by the foreigner builders to maintain their technology, their installations, and their constructs before and after their demise. And so, when they were created, they were designed specifically to be able to survive the firing of the halos by not having a central nervous system, of which the halos target. So now you can see why they're immune. Seeing as they're entirely artificial, their organs, limbs, and tissue are all made up of nanotechnology, totally inorganic despite their appearance, which only furthers their immunity. However, the engineers are still seen as targets by the Flood and will be killed by them, and regardless of their biomechanical nanomachine makeup, they apparently can still be used as biomass to aid in the creation of Flood structures, keymined forms, and gravemind. Now, this next one is something of a grey area, so it's not actually a species, but rather a group of individuals within a species who, thanks to a series of genetic augmentations, have almost gained a pseudo-immunity to the Flood. The Spartan ones, and notably, Sergeant Avery Johnson.
Me!
So, before Chief and the Spartan 2s, there existed a highly classified project known as the Orion Project, of which Sergeant Johnson was a candidate. The Orion Project was Oni's first proper attempt at a super soldier program, aiming to biologically augment soldiers beyond natural capabilities. These augmentations included muscular enhancements, pulmonary respiratory enhancements, retina inversion injections, and cochlear enhancement tuning, alongside a number of other augmentations aimed at improving brain function and motor skills. Now, although Orion candidates carried out a number of highly successful operations, many began exhibiting mental instability and other serious psychological issues, and so the project was disbanded, and the healthy candidates that remained were very covertly disseminated back into the regular military, and Sergeant Johnson was one of these individuals. Fast forward a couple decades to the events of Halo 1, and Johnson manages to escape the Flood research facility on Alpha Halo, the only survivor of both Marine squads that descended into the installation. Once the Halo was destroyed, he grouped up with Chief and Cortana in space, who were immediately skeptical of his survival given what they'd seen on Jenkins' helmet camera. I mean, it looked as though Johnson had been infected, he was covered in infection forms, and they never found any human survivors in the facility. So what the hell happened? Well, as a part of the highly experimental Orion augmentations, the electrical signals in Johnson's nervous system were disrupted. Infection forms interface with the host by forcing a resonant frequency to match the host's neural system, but because Johnson's nervous system was, well, as Chief put it, so jumbled, the infection forms simply couldn't force a match and couldn't convert him into a combat form. To Dr. Halsey's surprise, Johnson even had traces of Flood DNA in his bloodstream, dead and non-infectious, but some still intact Flood gene fragments still existed within him. This confirms that an infection form did begin the process of infection, it just failed because it couldn't tap into his nervous system. And furthermore, this partial infection actually gave Johnson strange regenerative abilities, so it didn't even harm him, it buffed him. You have to be a Chad on the level of Sergeant Johnson to not only be immune to the Flood, but for their infection to actually buff your physical capabilities. The man is truly remarkable.
How you doing?
Another immune species are the Prometheans. Now, I say species in very large air quotes because technically the Prometheans aren't a species, rather they're a group of entities, shall we say. Entities sounds about right. However, they have a 100% immunity to physical Flood infection. So, the Prometheans started out as the highest ranking of all the Forerunner warrior servants, led by the Didact. But as all attempts to stop the Flood's rapid consumption across the galaxy failed, even the Prometheans were getting desperate. So, the Didact used the Composer to digitize the essence of his Prometheans and place them in metal bodies. They became the Promethean Knights. Now, these knights were designed to be entirely uninfectable, and, well, they were. Not only did they not have a central nervous system, but they were entirely inorganic, made of complex metals and other materials, and so, as a result, couldn't be used as biomass. The Prometheans took the strengths of the Sentinels as anti-Flood warriors and combined them with the physical and mental strengths of the Ecumene's greatest warriors, but unfortunately, it was all done too late in the war. The Prometheans were really effective, but the Flood's numbers were simply too great for even them to put a dent in them. Had they been created earlier in the war and also in much vaster numbers, then perhaps the Foreigners would have been able to turn the tide against the Flood, but alas, they could not. But regardless of their failure, the Didact had managed to find a way for organic biological entities to gain an immunity to the Flood. The only problem was that it required the utter destruction of their physical bodies and the transfer of their soul into a metal carapace, which, as you can imagine, was excruciatingly painful. But the biggest talk of the proverbial Flood immunity town right now are the Endless. For what very little we know about them, there are some pretty strong signs pointing towards them potentially being immune to the Flood. Now, just to note, this is theoretical and isn't confirmed at least yet, but the evidence is rather glaring. So, why do people think this? Well, it all comes down to their immunity to the Halo Rings. The most logical reason to explain why the Endless were unaffected by the firing of the Halos is that they simply don't have a central nervous system for the Halo's pulls to target, and thus, they also can't be infected by the Flood. This is a pretty sound explanation, granted, but it's not without its problems. Now, this is a very big if, but if the Endless are in some way related to the Precursors, then this doesn't quite line up. You see, the Precursors and all of their technology and architecture were built using their concepts of neural physics, thus making them pseudo-organic, and as a result, were highly susceptible to the Halos. All Precursor artifacts were wiped out when the rings were fired, and so if the Endless are cut from the same cloth as the Precursors, then it doesn't quite make sense for them to suddenly be immune. Then again though, the Precursors are essentially the gods of the Halo universe, and so creating a descendant species that are immune to the Halos, just purely to spite the Foreigners and to get revenge for their genocide, would certainly be in the realm of possibility. But if that's not the case, there is also another possible explanation. The Endless's immunity to the Halos could be the result of some sort of time manipulation abilities. So, based on the current law, anything in slipspace is immune to the firing of the Halos because it almost acts as another dimension that their pulse can't reach. So, perhaps they do have a nervous system and are susceptible to Flood infection, but just happen to survive the Halos because of these time manipulation abilities. As I said though, this is entirely theoretical, but it was worth mentioning on the offhand chance that the Endless in fact don't have a central nervous system and are indeed immune to the Halos and, by extension, much worse, immune to the Flood. Now originally, that was the end of the video right there, but when I was writing it, I suddenly remembered a comment that I got a few weeks ago that made a really interesting argument about the Prophets possibly having some degree of immunity to the Flood, and I figured that this was the perfect video to address that. The comment asks if Bungie could have been loosely hinting at the Prophets having some sort of resistance to infection because of 3 factors. Number 1, Regret was conscious despite being fully assimilated into the Gravemind in Halo 2. Number 2, Mercy was able to somehow fight off an infection form and only died when Chief removed it from his chest. And number 3, Truth was seemingly able to fight off his infection for long enough to confront the Arbiter in Halo 3, instead of just instantly turning into a combat form upon infection, like literally every other entity. Now, yes, you could very easily just write all of these things off as artistic license, and it would make total sense. They just get explained away as the slight bending of narrative rules to allow a story to fit. But I still want to cover them one by one anyway, because there's a little bit of credence there. So, firstly, Regret being conscious when he's part of the Gravemind. Now, actually, Captain Keyes was still kinda partially conscious when being assimilated into the Proto-Gravemind in Halo 1, so much so that he was even able to briefly speak to Chief when he made it aboard the Truth and Reconciliation. That said though, that was Keyes being assimilated into a Proto-Gravemind, and in Halo 2, Regret has already been fully assimilated into a full Gravemind, and yet he's somehow still entirely conscious and even coherent. Now, yes, the reason for this could definitely be because he has some degree of immunity, but I think the more likely answer is that the Gravemind just simply chose to keep him alive so that he could expose his lies before the Arbiter, so that it'd convince Arbiter to aid Chief in stopping the Covenant from activating Delta Halo. Secondly, Mercy fighting off the infection form. Now, I'm gonna be honest, this one does stand out quite a bit. The infection form has very clearly got its tendrils around Mercy's neck, and it's burrowing into his spine. I mean, you can even see matter spraying out of his body, and by the time Chief gets to him, roughly a minute later, that matter has stopped being sprayed everywhere, and the infection form is stationary, which to me suggests that it had managed to tap into his spinal cord, and also his nervous system, and yet Mercy is still alive. In fact, it's not until Chief pulls the infection form off Mercy that he dies, and he dies instantly as well, which again suggests that the infection form was the only thing keeping him alive. The question is, why didn't Mercy start growing extra biomass, and also why didn't he turn into a combat form? And frankly, I don't really have a solid answer for this. I mean, my guess right now would be it's because Mercy was too bony and spindly, and the infection form kinda just didn't bother turning him into a combat form because he knew that he'd be weak, but that doesn't explain why the infection form stayed attached to him. I will say, this is definitely the most convincing example of the Prophets possibly having some sort of immunity, but then again, it likely does just come down to artistic license. And thirdly, Truth fighting off his infection for so long, and even going as far as wresting control of his sentience back from the Gravemind like Jenkins did with the infection form, is quite an interesting one. Again, the practical answer for why this happened was simply just artistic license, but canonically, the Gravemind likely kept Truth alive for his own pleasure and enjoyment, and also to relish in his death. It wouldn't be the first time that the Gravemind has let one of his foes live purely to inflict psychological damage on them and others around them. I mean, that's literally what he did verbatim with the Didact during the Flood War. He was captured, but infected him with the Logic Plague instead of a physical infection, and then let him go back to Foreigner Space to utterly shatter his warriors' morale. Mind games and psychological torture are the Gravemind's modus operandi, and to be honest, all of these Prophet-related oddities could very much just come down to that. But what if they don't? Is there any other evidence out there that suggests that the Prophets could have some degree of immunity to the Flood? Well, actually, there kind of could be. So, when the Ancient Prophets were defeated during the Human-Foreigner War, the Foreigners, as a punishment for rising up against them, quarantined the Prophets to just 3 worlds, to forever be overwatched by their victors. This defeat and quarantine radically changed their society, from one of pleasure to one of devout religion, becoming the Prophets that we know of today, and at the time, they were led by an individual known as the First Prophet. Now, this First Prophet once told the Didact that should the Flood ever return, he would reveal to him the cure for the Flood, but unfortunately he was killed before he could do so. Now, unlike every other mention of a cure in the Foreigner trilogy, the way this one is framed and spoken about is just kind of different. This is definitely my own subjective interpretation of it, but to me, the way that Greg Bear wrote about this secret information that the First Prophet had really made it seem like it was different, like it actually had some credence, unlike every other cure attempt. It never seemed like a hoax or like a wild goose chase. It seemed like something that actually had merit to it. This was the closest that we've ever come to confirmation that the prophets had some sort of cure, which would of course provide them with immunity. But whether they actually did or not, we'll sadly never know, because Faber accidentally killed the first prophet, and all of his knowledge went to the grave with him. So, are the prophets immune to the flood? Well, not to rain on anyone's parade or anything, but if you ask me, I don't think so. All three of their apparent immunities in the trilogy could very easily just be written off as artistic license, or the Gravemind playing mind games with his foes. But I will say, it's an interesting idea nonetheless. And so that concludes every species, every pseudo-species, every group of entities, and every group within a species that has or could have some degree of flood immunity or total immunity to the flood in Halo's lore. As you can tell, I tried to cover every single base possible in this video. Now you know which species you need to cozy up to should the flood arrive in our galaxy. Just make friends with an engineer, or with a hunter, or maybe even with a secret Spartan 1, and you might just survive the outbreak. And so, on that bombshell, I kinda need to round this video out now because I'm sort of in the middle of making friends with the local hunters. I'm sure you guys understand. So, on that note, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual, and thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you all in the next one.